Thank you for tuning in today, and welcome to The Source, a program dedicated to providing a platform to whistleblowers, former insiders, and policy experts. My name is Zain Raza. Today we'll be talking to former United States military analyst who used to work for the RAND Corporation, also known as Research and Development Corporation. In 1971, he exposed the Pentagon papers that showed how the US government is systematically lying to the public about its wars in Southeast Asia. He's also an author, and the book that we will be talking about today is called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Daniel Ellsberg, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
Before we get into your book, I want to talk primarily about your biography, because we have a big following of young viewers that may not be aware of the Pentagon papers that you released in 1971. Talk about your case, why you decided to become a whistleblower, the information that you released, and how the US government reacted to it.
Well, then, how long an answer do you want? I've written 2 books on that subject. I guess very briefly, I had worked on the escalation of the war in Vietnam reluctantly. I didn't really believe in it, but it was my job in the Pentagon in 1964 and 65. Once we were committed to a large war, I wanted to see it up close and see if the reporting was accurate, what could be done. I had been a Marine company commander in peacetime in the 50s. And so when I got to Vietnam as a State Department official, I used my training to walk with troops in combat and observe the war up close. And I did that for 2 years, evaluating pacification in 38 of the 43 provinces of Vietnam. So I had a pretty good widespread view of what was happening in the war and understood that there was no prospect of any progress toward any of the U.S. aims, whether they were legitimate or not. And I assumed they were at the beginning. They were not, as a matter of fact, but it took me a while to learn that. What I did learn was that they were not going to be achieved, whatever, and that people were being killed on both sides to no end, to no good end. There was no excuse for it. So after 2 years, I came back with hepatitis, so I couldn't be in the field anymore. And I began advising people inside the government of my view that we should extricate ourselves from that war, that we should get out of it. And many people agreed with that, but the question was what to do about it. What I was doing was talking to insiders, and they were going along with the war. Their jobs depended on it, just as mine had earlier. And the war did go on. I then was assigned to a study of decision-making in Vietnam, which had hoped would reveal how we had gotten into such a debacle and done so badly. It was known as the McNamara study, or History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. It actually, we continued working on it through 68. It actually ended in 68, early 68, in the belief that President Johnson meant to end the war. He'd gotten out of the campaign and had proposed negotiations with the North, and most people took that as the beginning of the end of the war. It wasn't, in fact. The war went on 7 years longer. So, and it would have gone on even longer than that if a number of very unusual events hadn't intervened, one of which was my release of this history, top secret history of the war in 1971. But that didn't end the war by itself, by any means. The war had 4 years left to go. So many other people had to behave in unusual ways, doing whistleblowing, telling the truth, making decisions they weren't expected to make, that made it possible to face President Nixon with impeachment and get him to resign, and that made the war endable. What I'd learned by that time was the war was not going to end while Richard Nixon was still in office. And in early 1973, he had just won a landslide election. It seemed quite impossible that he would be out of office before 1977. So that seemed the only way to bet that the war would, when the war would end. Nevertheless, a lot of us kept working, doing our best to try to shorten the war. And rather miraculously, that did come about, and the war did end in 1975 instead of 1977. Meanwhile, I had been put on trial, facing a possible 115 years in prison, 12 felony counts in a federal courthouse, covering almost 2 years in court for having copied the Pentagon Papers. And there was scheduled to be another trial for the distribution in which I'd also been involved. It so happened I had also copied many papers relating to our nuclear policy, and it was my intention to put those out after the Pentagon Papers trial. That became impossible when a hurricane dispersed the field in which they'd been buried, a trash heap actually, and we couldn't find the papers again. But Nixon did fear that I had information on his nuclear threats, which the public was entirely unaware of. Obviously, the North Vietnamese, the Russians, the Chinese were not unaware because he was making the threats to them, but it was a secret from the American public. And he feared I not only knew it, which I did, but that I had documents on it, which was plausible, but in fact, I didn't. And that led him to try to keep me from releasing those documents by blackmailing me, even incapacitating me. At one point, he sent 12 people up to incapacitate me totally, at a moment when he feared I would reveal his nuclear threats. And these were crimes which, when they came to be known, which was unlikely, faced him with impeachment or even prosecution, and led to his resignation.
I want to begin with your book now, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Could you talk about the underlying assumptions and principles on which the nuclear war plans, US nuclear war plans, that you also helped build were based upon?
Yes, I had early on, as a young man in the late 50s, had been working on the command and control of nuclear weapons and the design of nuclear war plans for the RAND Corporation as a consultant to the Defense Department. And in the course of that, I had learned a great deal about our war plans to see how they might be implemented or not implemented under enemy attack. So I was perhaps uniquely familiar with the plans as a civilian at that point. They were closely held among the military. I became aware of very grotesque aspects of the plans, but let me sum up what I saw in them then and what continues to this day. The fact is that without intending to, both the US, followed later by the Soviets, had constructed what can be called doomsday machines. That is, elaborate systems of men, hardly any women at that time, machines, computers, communication networks, airplanes, missiles, warheads, submarines, all wired together to accomplish, if they were launched, if the system were launched into action at the orders of the president or someone else, to accomplish the death of nearly everyone on Earth. Half of them within days, hours, weeks of the attacks, and the other half suffering starvation over the next 6 months as smoke from burning cities covered the entire globe with stratospheric smokes that would cut out most sunlight and kill all harvests. We didn't know that at the time that I was working on the plans in the early 60s. It was 20 years later, 1983, when scientists discovered this effect. But that was 35 years ago, and the situation remains the same. Each side retains the ability to destroy most life on Earth, retains a doomsday machine, and far from dismantling it, either unilaterally, which they should, or together, which they also should. Each of them is modernizing that machine at a cost of over $500 billion in the next 10 years and over $1 trillion, perhaps $2 trillion over the next 30 years, rebuilding doomsday machines. Now, these should not exist. They should never have been imagined. They should never have been built, should never have been maintained on either side. Other countries have a capability of annihilating people at a lower scale. No one can produce the full-scale nuclear winter that we can by burning so many cities. but they can produce a mini nuclear winter that would kill perhaps a third of the Earth's population by starvation. And I'm talking now of the arsenals of India and Pakistan, who are currently at war with each other and who are holding about a third of the Earth's population as hostage to their decision whether to go to war or not. That would seem intolerable. It would seem that any country on Earth has the right to tell either Pakistan, India, both, you don't have any right to threaten each other with the rest of us as collateral damage, as hostages that will be killed in your conflict without having any part of it. But of course, that applies, 100-fold over to the US and Russia. India and Pakistan together have less than 1% of what the US and Russia have. And then we have China with some 300 warheads. It takes about 200 to produce this nuclear winter. So they have more than they can really justify by any means, but still less than 1/10 of what we have. So the real pressure is on the US and Russia to spare the world this threat that they have hanging over everyone else on Earth, what John F. Kennedy called a sword of Damocles suspended by a thread for all the people of the Earth and subject to accident. One of the things that can trigger and the most likely thing that would trigger either of these doomsday machines is a false alarm from their warning system that warns them, that tells them that an incoming attack is on the way when it isn't. That has happened recurrently and very convincingly, and it's been a miracle that none of them has reached the point of response that has destroyed us. We wouldn't be here without that kind of luck. And it may go another 70 years with that kind of luck, almost miraculous. It's not impossible. It's just very, very unlikely. So it's very urgent for the people of the world, really, to recognize the position that the US and Russia have put them in, and to a lesser extent, the other nuclear states, and demand that this threat be lifted. There's not the remotest justification for using a threat of doomsday as an instrument of policy or preparing to carry it out. And yet that is the highest scientific and military task of these two superpowers.
Could you talk briefly about the principles on the reasoning on why this was all justified?
Well, the basic justification to the people involved inside, and they do need some explanation for what they're doing, little as they may know of it, is not a justification that is spelled out very much to the public because it's all kept generally secret from the public. But what the two explanations share is the notion that the only way to deter a nuclear attack on oneself is to have the capability to retaliate with a nuclear attack. And that is plausible, actually. It has undoubtedly played some role in the fact that there has been no nuclear war. I say some role because it's not at all clear what might have happened, that there would have been a major war without nuclear weapons. But undoubtedly, their existence has contributed to the lack of a major war between the US and Russia in these last 70 years. That's a benefit, purchased at the cost of a possibility of blowing up human civilization, which fortunately is a cost that hasn't yet been paid, but could eventuate almost any time, even as we're talking, with possibilities of new conflict in Syria. By the way, let's think how many nuclear powers have been involved in conflict in Syria in the last decade or so, mostly, in varying combinations and alliances. Russia, the US, Britain, nuclear power, France, a nuclear power, Turkey, not a nuclear power, but a member of a nuclear armed alliance, every member of which, including the nuclear powers, Britain, France, and the US, are committed to defending Turkey. So I think we can count them as invoking nuclear war possibly. Well, that's 5. Let's see. Oh, Israel. Let's put 6 in there. So 6 of the 9 nuclear states are involved in an ongoing conflict in one state. Who does that leave out? India, Pakistan so far, and North Korea. The other 6, all involved. Is that dangerous? How can it not be seen as other than incredibly dangerous, even if the likelihood is low of an all-out nuclear war resulting? It is not 0, absolutely not. And it should be, of course it should be. How could the possibility of who rules Syria justify the risk of ending human life on Earth? And yet that's where we are.
In your book, you talk about your time as an analyst, where you uncovered a lot of procedural and structural problems when it came to nuclear planning. Just to quote a few facts that you uncovered, there was a problem of delegation and more emphasis to assure that a reliable first strike happens instead of preventing unauthorized action. You also talk about lack of real situation practice drills due to safety issues. There was no stop order, discrepancies in the two-man rule where 2 people need to put the code simultaneously, and no alternative planning. Can you talk about these points that you uncovered back then briefly?
Well, then you've just told the audience, I think, the points very well. You're right. You read the book well, and that is what is described in there. But just to focus, let's say, on one of them. People tremble, many people in the world tremble at the thought of our current president, Donald J. Trump, being capable of setting the Doomsday Machine in motion by his single will, not susceptible legally or constitutionally to challenge by any other American. If he decides to do it, there is no arrangement for anyone countermanding the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States. So when we look at him on Twitter or YouTube or press conferences today, we're looking at someone who could choose to end life on Earth if the mood so took him. And that is hardly reassuring. I don't need to go into that. But where people have a false reassurance is that they believe that only the president can set that machine in motion. That has never been true. It has never been true that there is only one finger on a nuclear button, whether it's Trump's or anyone else. And the same is true of Russia, and almost surely true, though we don't know the details, in every other nuclear state. Very simply, if it were true, then a simple assassin's bullet, or perhaps one bomb on the Capitol, would paralyze the retaliatory capability and the deterrent capability of the nuclear state. A simple terrorist weapon, let's say, could make the nuclear state totally vulnerable to any attack, if it were the case that only the president or the head of state could send them off. Having said that, it then seems very obvious that each state has made arrangements that that can't happen by delegating that position, if not all the time, to at least to situations where there are indications of an attack or where the communications are out with the Capitol. And that's true very commonly for atmospheric reasons, for technical reasons, failures of various kinds, that commanders with nuclear weapons are out of touch with their capital, and it has been arranged that they're on their own. It's also possible that they can launch their weapons without assurance that they're on their own, just because they decide that the time has come to do it. Just this yesterday, as we speak, one of these leaders, Donald Trump, sent out a tweet about Turkey with pretty much the words, "If I, in my great and unmatched wisdom," sounding like a Persian emperor of 2,000 years ago, Ptolemy perhaps, "if I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, decide that Turkey is off limits, and he doesn't define even what the limits are. I will totally and entirely destroy, not Turkey, he says, but the Turkish economy. But he could just as well have said the Turkish people. Of course, in doing that, the radioactive fallout would involve far more than Turkey. And for that matter, destroying the Turkish economy would damage far more than Turkey. So that's the mood that he's in, his godlike power of annihilation. What I'm saying is there can be other people in the systems who said it's not only Donald Trump, my president, who has great and unmatched wisdom. I have as much wisdom as Donald Trump. That's a low bar, actually. Many people match the wisdom of Donald Trump, all too many. And they may choose to act on it in as grandiose a manner as he does, little as they are justified in doing so. So it's a dangerous world, very much, and it has been made so by decisions of president after president, and in Russia as well, where a dead hand exists arranging for missile commanders to have the ability or even to be countermanded by an electronic signal in the event that Moscow is destroyed. That reflects our own arrangements. So both sides have provoked the other into an extremely unstable and dangerous thing where a mistake doesn't just mean, let's say, an embarrassment, but the end of the world.
One of the things that really shocked me when I read your book is there is no plan for when a missile is launched or a plane is sent, there's no way to recall them, even in an event where misunderstandings or miscommunication happens. Once the single integrated operations plan that you talk about in your book is set into motion, there's no way to call it back. Do you think that's still the case today?
Of course, it's always been the case with missiles. You see, that what you're talking about, that dangerous system, applied to a period when we relied on planes, bombers, rather than missiles. And that kind of arrangement made the plane like a missile, incapable of being called back. In principle or in practice, generally a plane can be communicated with in order to come back. But the actual orders had been given that once an execute order had been received, the plane should not allow any interference, any signal with someone purporting to be the president. There was no authentication code given them that would identify the president. And that would seem insane, and it was insane. But the rationalization was twofold. The open was the Russians might gain that code and thereby paralyze our response of our bombers. Remember, none of this applies to missiles. Once they go, they can't be called back. Let me put a footnote on that, if I may. Strictly speaking, even with a missile, you can put a destruct code in it that would destroy it or send it into the ocean prior to its arriving at its target. That is true of every test missile. If it's going off course, there is an arrangement to destroy it. Send it either down or explode it in the air. You could do that with every operational missile just as well. But that runs into the other problem, another problem. It's not just the Russians that might get that code. The military are afraid that the lily-livered civilian leader might have cold feet, quote, to use all the metaphors involved here, and decide to rescind his order once he'd given it. So they wanted to assure that no civilian in particular, and they couldn't do it either. They denied it of themselves, but then they didn't expect to want to recall anything. But if a civilian wanted to recall either the missiles or the planes, he couldn't do it. Or in future days, she couldn't do it, which would be even more worrisome to them, I suppose. So although strictly speaking, in our patriarchal societies, a woman who gets to the highest office will not differ significantly from the patriarchs who have preceded her. In fact, she will have to prove that she's as tough as any of the men she succeeded, and she's, if anything, more likely to push a button than even a man might be. That's the world we live in.
In December 1960, in a Strategic Air Command meeting with the Joint Chief of Staff, you talk about in your book that there was a chart presented that showed a staggering figure of 600 million deaths, which would occur if a nuclear strike by the United States takes place. How did they arrive at this conclusion? And what is your assessment of your figure when you were sitting in that meeting? How did you react when you heard about that?
Yes, I may have been the first civilian of any status to actually see an estimate, an official estimate, of how many people would be killed if we executed our war plans. The war plans I was helping draft guidance for under McNamara in 1961. So since I was in that role, I drafted a question which the president sent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was simply, if your plans were executed as planned, and that meant primarily before enemy weapons have launched. The idea of waiting until enemy warheads have arrived in the U.S. and then retaliating was always a worst case that they hoped they would avoid under any circumstances. So the plans were all based on the hope and expectation that our warheads would get off the ground before theirs had arrived. And if that were carried out, how many people would die? And the answer came back in the form of a graph with millions of dead on the vertical axis on the left, and time, months, on the horizontal axis, because deaths would accrue month by month from radioactive fallout from the initial attacks. And it was a very simple chart, which told us that the first death toll in the first days or weeks would be 275 million people. Nearly all civilians, obviously, since the armies of the world didn't add up to that. But this was in Russia, the Soviet Union, and China, which was at that time planned to be hit under any circumstances. We were fighting Russians wherever, since they were supposed to be, or imagined to be, part of an indissoluble Sino-Soviet bloc, although that was actually no longer true even by 1961. Okay, 275, with 50,000 more dying over the next 6 months by radioactivity, adding up to 325 million. But that was just from the Soviet Union and China alone, which is what I'd asked to narrow the task. So we asked how many altogether. And a week later, we got a table in the White House that elaborated that. Turned out they had answers to that too. About 100 million more in East Europe, where we weren't actually, in theory, attacking cities, but we were attacking air defenses so that our planes could get in. And the air defenses were all next to cities. Then 100 million in West Europe, with no warheads landing there from us, but from radioactivity from the east, depending on which way the wind blew, which depended on the season to a large extent. And finally, a third additional 100 million in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union and China, like Afghanistan, Austria, Finland, all neutrals, as you see there, Sweden, and Japan and northern India. A total of 600 million. 100 holocausts. I looked at that as the most evil plan and piece of paper that had ever existed in the history of human wartime planning or any other kind. And even that was a great underestimate of what they were willing to kill, because they were deliberately excluding fire, the main effect of thermonuclear weapon, casualty causing effect of H-bombs, thermonuclear weapons. And they excluded that because it was too hard to calculate. It depended on wind and on fuel loading and season and various things. So they just left that out. To this day, if you put that in, you're up to now over 1 billion out of what was then 3 billion world population, a third of the Earth's population. Now, a willingness to kill a third of the Earth's population, this is before Russian retaliation, which guaranteed 100 million in Europe, for example, in retaliation with their short-range weapons. It demonstrated a kind of morality or immorality that I don't know anyone else had ever imagined in a human mind or action. But again, 23 years later, in 1983, scientists revealed that something the military had not looked at, fire, generated smoke. And the firestorms from military weapons, which loft smoke into the upper troposphere, the upper atmosphere, from which it is further heated and moves into the stratosphere, meant that a cloud of smoke would quickly surround the globe and not rain out, and would stay what we now know is more than a decade, cutting off 70% of the sunlight, creating ice age conditions on the surface of the Earth, and killing all harvests that year and for the next 8 or 10 years, meaning that nearly everyone on Earth would starve within a year, except, scientists say, possibly some number of people eating fish and mollusks in the deep southern hemisphere in New Zealand or Australia. So extinction is not even likely to occur, it's unlikely. But the annihilation of 98 or 99% of humans within a year, if our plans are carried out as planned now, with our current weapons, will be extinguished. I would think hardly means saying that under any system of morality ever conceived, and they vary quite a bit over times and over cultures, I don't think there's one that could say this was that accomplishing this, or even planning and creating the capability for it, it's other than ultimately immoral, worse than anything there ever does. It goes beyond any notion of criminality or legality, rationality. It's insane and immoral, and that's what we have now.
Since the United States has gained nuclear supremacy, each administration, and you provide a very lengthy list in your book about this, have used nuclear weapons not in the practical sense, but in terms of threats, and you go on to provide an example of a loaded gun. Could you elaborate on this example and whether these threats have been effective at all?
Yeah. There's a misconception that nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Actually, they've been used several dozen times, mostly in secret, used in the way that a gun is used when it's pointed at someone's head in a confrontation, whether or not the trigger is pulled. Actually, the gun is best use is if you get your way with such a threat without having to pull the trigger. And that's basically why you have the gun and why these various countries have acquired the nuclear gun, in order to make these threats, whether deterrent or compellent, blackmail, whatever. And those threats have been backed up by a real capability, at least, if not an intention, to carry them out if they don't succeed. Almost surely some of the threats have been bluffs, others were not. And we didn't get a war either because there was no provocation or the other side didn't intend at all or back down. So we've been lucky, I would say, to come out of cases. Some of these cases have been very close. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in particular in 1962, but that's not the only one. There was a hidden crisis on the Soviet side in 1983 where Premier Andropov was under the belief that Ronald Reagan was crazy, the way perhaps the present president is deceived with his talk of evil empire and his buildup of nuclear weapons of the kind that's going on right now, first strike type nuclear weapons. And Andropov, there was in fact a false alarm on the Soviet side that could very well have ended life on Earth if the colonel in charge hadn't decided to lie, really, to his superiors and conceal from them the degree to which he felt they might actually be under attack. Now, that brings up two issues as to how nuclear war may actually occur. The first is through escalation of a limited war that perhaps goes nuclear on the basis of small nuclear weapons, relatively small, of the kind both sides are producing right now, by the way, with hopes of using them in a way that would not escalate, but those hopes are almost certainly to be falsified in the actual event if they use them against each other. A nuclear weapon against a non-nuclear state like Iran would not blow up the world. It would kill millions of people unjustifiably, but it wouldn't lead to the reciprocation. But any talk of first use against each other by the US and Russia, which does occur right now as a possibility and which we're prepared for, is nothing other than a threat to blow up the world, even though the initial move may be much smaller than that, with a weapon smaller than Hiroshima. But the likelihood of reciprocation that actually goes upwards in a spiral that ends in a full-scale attack is extremely high. So first-use threats and the possibility they raise of being carried out are an extreme danger to this world and should be refused. The world should demand that nuclear threats be eschewed, be foregone in the various states. Only China and India, to some extent right now, has a commitment to no first use. That should be the case in all of the 9 nuclear states and their allies, the NATO allies, the first. The second point is a long-term delusion that although a nuclear war would in any case be very, very calamitous and catastrophic, it never says so. There are degrees of catastrophe, and that a first strike is less damaging to the attacker than a second strike, than waiting to be attacked. So that if you have indications that the other side may or is about to attack in the short run, or perhaps is on the way to doing it, both sides are readied on a hair trigger's notice, on a matter of minutes of warning, to launch its own forces so as to get in a preemptive attack first. This is entirely delusional. There will be no difference between a first strike and a second strike once the clouds have reached the stratosphere and destroyed all the crops. The attackers' people will starve just as the people attacked and everyone else. In other words, the whole world is hostage to an attack between the US and Russia in particular, to a lesser extent between India and Pakistan. And there is no excuse for this, conceivably, for this situation to arrive. So again, the world should demand that this delusion of damage limiting by striking first be abandoned and recognized as a hoax, as it is. The reason that isn't done is that pursuing that capability, that supposed capability of striking first, is very profitable on both sides. Russia, after all, is a capitalist country too now. They have a military-industrial complex that profits from making new missiles on top of the old, just as the US does. And Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon and Grumman competing to build new missiles, which are nothing other than hair triggers to a doomsday machine and should not exist, nevertheless profit very much until the Holocaust actually happens, and then they don't lose more than anybody. Everyone loses everything. So the incentives are there to keep it going, and of course on both sides they can buy votes by they can bribe politicians with campaign donations. There are jobs at stake. The unions even involved don't want to lose their jobs. making parts of the Doomsday Machine. And all of those is so much built into our political economy that it is, in fact, very hard to change, even though there is no national security benefit. On the contrary, the existence and these plans and these delusions of damage limiting in a war, where, to put it this way, nearly everyone recognizes that the profitable making of anti-ballistic missiles is a total hoax, a pork barrel, for the purpose of profits and jobs, that it cannot possibly work. What's less obvious is that the idea of destroying the other ICBMs by attacking them, the counterforce action, is also a hoax, because submarine missiles, which can't be targeted this way, are more than enough to destroy the attacker's society and the rest of the world. So this profitable hoax, it's as if, for example, the pyramids had been, on the one hand, a source of profit. I don't know how that worked in the economy of Egypt, and that they were made of dynamite somehow, with the possibility that lightning would destroy the country. Yet it went on. That's the kind of lemming-like self-destructive behavior we've been involved in for 70 years. It must stop, and it's up to the world to, just as the world is waking up to the existential danger of climate change, to which all the countries are contributing somewhat, but ours most of all. I hope that they will wake up to the other existential danger of piling up warheads and missiles that can destroy life.
You just mentioned climate change. There's so many movements emerging on the climate front, but none of them have taken any significant steps in addressing militarization, let alone the nuclear threat that we talked about today. Which threat would you classify as higher? And what can individuals do to influence significant change on the nuclear issue?
The climate movement, which is growing now, in particular that worldwide movement led by Greta Thunberg, a great hero of mine now, who I met in Sweden, I would say take it as the example to follow in the case of the nuclear, of really expressing to the grown-ups and to the world that the situation is intolerable, is dangerous and intolerable, can change and must change. And I think Greta Thunberg's method of inducing people to strike on a weekday, not just the Saturday demonstration, but a withdrawal of cooperation of work from classes and from work on a weekday, is a very powerful method, a general strike. Notice it has not yet had noticeable effect on climate, but I think and perhaps nothing will. But it is, to me, the most promising approach that has been used, and I would like to see that applied. So I take encouragement from what that one small person, Greta Thunberg, has achieved in the way of mobilizing resistance to an intolerable status quo.
Daniel Ellsberg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. If you like this sort of content, be sure to click on the subscribe button below and to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. My name is Raza. See you guys next time.